Hello and welcome to another class on history of the Bible. We are in the second book of Samuel. The last chapters actually, chapter 21, 22, and maybe 23 today. Towards the end of David's life, the end of David's career. And, we've been discussing the land of David in the land of Israel and in the Judean desert and in the Midbar Yehuda, the hills of Judea. And I am giving this class from top of my apartment here, new apartment in Efrat, overlooking the actual hills of Jerusalem and Judea, which is pretty amazing. So you get to talk about the Tanakh and actually do it in the place of the Tanakh, and that's the miracle of living in modern day Israel. Okay, we're going to go to our text, but first we're doing the last 5 chapters, and I found an interesting article by a friend of mine, Rabbi Amnon Bazak, who gives us a very important context of these last chapters. So the chapter we're going to discuss is David and the Givenites, but if you look at the last chapters of Sefer Shmuel Bet, we have the following 6 themes. Number 1 is something bad happens with the story of, and there's a story of David and a group of people called the Givenites. Then there are these wars against the Philistines, the song of David, David's last words, more about warriors, and the story of the census, which is also a bit of a punishment for David. So it seems to be a bit of a chiastic structure where the 1st and the 6th represent, events that took place that were as a result of some kind of sinning that took place and there was punishment. And then the 2nd and the 5th represent battles. And the 3rd and the 4th represent David's last words and his songs and praises to God. It's almost like a bookends of, or a little microcosm of the entire book of David's life, right? So beginning and end with events and stories and histories, some good, some bad, and couched by a lot of battles, but the heart of it is David's singing to God. Then we move over to Samuel 2 and chapter 21. It begins with, sorry if I'm moving around a little bit, it begins with, there was a famine. There was a famine. Now, in biblical times, when there's a famine, there's a punishment. In other words, this is God punishing the people. He does it through a famine. And the question is, why? David had no idea. For 3 years, it doesn't rain in the land of Israel. And David wants to know what happened. So what does David do? He calls to God. He seeks God. And interestingly, it's after 3 years. I mean, you would think it would have happened earlier, but at some point it's not, you feel like it's a natural phenomenon, and then you realize, no, this is unusual. So he seeks God, and God says, it's for Saul and the house of blood that he killed the people from Givon. It's a very cryptic statement. First of all, David is being punished for something that Saul did. That's interesting in its own right. Okay. Secondly, and that we kind of understand that, God, sees collective responsibility. And if something Saul did and then Saul died, it still has to be repaid. If Saul did something that the Tanakh doesn't really tell us, which is fascinating, it doesn't tell us what he did. Only afterwards, it says this was something which incurred God's wrath. So what is it? What's the story of the Givonim? In order to understand that, we need to just remember, because we studied it together in the book of Joshua, there was a commandment to kill the 7 nations. Okay, God commanded that. You have to kill men, women, and child. It's a very complicated story, but it's the divine will of God. They represent something evil, something that cannot be stick around, and therefore they had to kill them. a group of people who lived in a place called Givon, which was part of the Canaan, part of the Canaanites that were supposed to be killed. They dressed up as if they were from far land. And they came to Joshua and they said, we're from a far land. Can you please help us? And we'll take care of you. We'll carry your water. We'll chop your trees. Can you swear to us, though, that you won't kill us? So Joshua thought that they were foreign. So he said, yeah, I swear. Now, as a result of that oath, then it was found out that they actually were Canaanites. Now, you'd say, big deal, though. There was on false pretenses. But here's the message of this chapter, is that oaths, swearing in God's name in ancient times is very, very severe. It's very important. Even if it was done on false pretenses, once you swear in God's name, you don't go back. And therefore, the Tanakh continues and says that during the time of Joshua, they were kept around. During the time of Samuel, everyone knew that the Givenites, they have a special status. During the time of the end of Samuel, same thing. But during the time of Saul, apparently he attacked them and he killed some of them. All right, and that's what we're going to read in verse 2. King summoned the Givenites and he asked the Givenites, what's going on? And they said, we were actually from Amori, which is one of the 7 nations. And Saul wanted to kill us all. The commentaries say, well, did he kill or didn't he kill? It sounds like he killed a lot of them and tried to wipe out all of them. And David now realizes he has to make up for Saul's sin. And the way you do that is by trying to appease the Givenites. So he says in verse 3, what can I do to make expiation, which is to get forgiveness, so that God will finally stop the famine? So the Givenite says, we don't care about gold and silver, and we don't care about random people, which means that David offered gold and silver. And we offered also that, okay, we'll send you our prisoners or our Jews who are criminals, who will send you someone. They said, no, we don't want that. You know what we want? And look at verse 5. Those who killed us, we want them to pay. They broke the oath, which is a shvuah. So in verse 6, give us shiv'ah, give us 7. In Hebrew, the word shvuah, oath, and 7, sheva, are very, very similar. So it's a play on words. David hears from them that they want the family of the king of Saul. They want them to be given, to be killed, I suppose, right? To be killed in lieu of the infraction of Saul. David has to give away 7 Israelites from the house of the king of Saul. It's a difficult question. He doesn't seek God in this point, but we'll see at the end of the story that God is appeased. He gives almost all of them, but he doesn't give Mephibosheth. Now, if you remember, Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan, the grandson of Saul, that David made an oath to Mephibosheth that he will take care of him. So he said he decided he'll give 7 others. Who's he going to give? So Saul, remember, kings in those days had lots of concubines and lots of children from all over the place. So he gave the following. Ritzpah bat Ayah was a concubine of Saul, and she had 2 sons. And 5 of Michal, the daughter of Saul's sons, who was married to Azriel ben Barzillai from Mecholah. And a different Mephibosheth, Armoni, and 5 other sons. And he gives them, in verse 9, to the Givenites, and they hang them, they impale them on the mountain before the Lord. All 7 of them die, put to death in the first days of the harvest. It's strange that they say that. Ritzpah bat Ayah felt so bad that her sons were killed, and she kind of doesn't want the birds to eat from her body, the body of her children, and she kind of, or the beasts, and she protects the bodies of her children, which is very admirable. David is told that in verse 11. And in 12, David takes the bones of Saul, the bones of Jonathan, together with the bones of those people who were just murdered, and he buries them all in the grave of Kish, Shaul's father. And that's the end of the story. It's possible that David made a bit of a mistake by not burying bones of Saul earlier, and maybe he is a bit responsible for this, but otherwise it's basically a story of showing the importance of an oath, and that we take it very seriously in Judaism, and David has to give up members of the tribe of Israel and the family of Saul for things to go right. And then in verse 14, God is appeased, and the land, and it starts to rain. The famine ends. The chapter continues that there's another battle, the Philistines against Israelites, as was through the entire kingdom, the entire history of David. And David, when he hears about the battle, he starts putting on his armor. And he went out to battle, and he got really tired. And you know what? We don't know exactly, but David was old at this time. So people, and people were trying to kill David. Everyone wanted to go, if you kill David, therefore, at that point, Avishai killed someone who was trying to kill David, but he made an oath that David could no longer go out to battle. Understand that it's very hard for the king to realize that he can't go out any longer, and he's not as young as he used to be. But it's something that needs to happen. Everyone realizes that they're getting on, and their actions will be more detrimental than otherwise. The war continues with the Philistines. Another war, and it tells us about all the different people that were courageous and were valiant. And I think what was happening here is that the camera is shifting from David to his warriors, whereas for the bulk of his life it was about he and his great feats and his great efforts and actions against the enemy. Here it seems that he's has to stay where he is, and others are taking over. And this is how the chapter ends. So it's a bit of a transition, slowing down, David realizing that it's time to move on to the next generations. And at this point, he sings a song. This is really his last call. Now there are 2 chapters about it. His last words to God. I guess looking back on his life, according to the Midrash, David died at 70 years old. So maybe he was towards the end of his life here. And it's actually a very, very long and somewhat repetitive. I was about to say psalm, but it's a chapter of Samuel, in which he thanks God, and it's interesting what he thanks about. If you look at it, the first verse says that God saved him from the hands of all his enemies, which you think, the Philistines, and from the hands of Saul. So he goes all the way back to his earliest days, And he's basically thanking God for, all the times that he saved him during his entire career, kingship. And he says, Vayomar Adonai Salim Utzulatim Ifatili. It's very rhythmic and very poetic. God is my rock, my fortress, one who saves me. I find shelter in him. He defends me. He's my salvation. He's my defender. He saves me from violence. And then he says, Mehulal akra Adonai u'me'avai ivasheach. I will praise and call out to you, God, for from my enemies I will be saved through you. And then he says, because I've always been surrounded by death, and they've all been trying to kill me. And whenever I was in trouble, I called out to you. And you heard my voice, and you heard my pleas, and you moved heaven and earth and shook the very foundations in order to save me. And you blew out smoke from your nostrils, and it's very, very dramatic expression. You bent the sky and came down in thick clouds, and you sing, very descriptive metaphors of God's presence and God's power. Made darkness and clouds and thunder and brilliance and fire and thunders from the heavens, sending bolts of lightning or bolts of physical or whatever kind of arrows. The bed of the sea was exposed by God's powers. God reached down from up high and took me. These are fighter jets that are on top of my head. Once again, he repeats himself. He says, Yatzileni mi oivi az. He rescued me from my strong enemies. He becomes my protector. God will repay me or rewarded me for my righteousness. And then he says, Ki shamarti darchei Hashem v'lo rashati melahai. For on the whole, right, he doesn't exactly talk about his sins. He says, I did guard the ways of God, and I didn't sin, and I wasn't guilty. I was all mindful of all his rules. I never departed from his laws, which is like the closest David gets to talking about how he, followed the mitzvot. I was blameless, I was innocent before him and guarded against my sins. And God responded in kind. And he waxes a bit poetic and says, God, with those who are righteous, you deal righteously. With those who are blameless, you deal blamelessly. With those who are pure, you deal with purity. But those who are wicked or evil or perverse, you are wily and dangerous. In other words, you give each person their due and what needs to be done. The poor person, you give victory, and the haughty you will bring down. You kind of make them low. Ki ata neiri Adonai, v'Adonai yagia choshchi. For you, God, are my light. You light up the darkness. With you, I can rush the barriers. With my God, I can scale a wall. The way of God is perfect. The way of the Lord is pure. He's a shield to all who take refuge in him. For there's no one beyond God. There was no one who will protect me. There's no one who will take care of me. God, gives me strength and made me fast. He also taught me war. He taught me how to fight when I needed to, and gave me strength and gave me protection, and watched my steps, and my feet never slipped. And I was able to run after my enemies and attack them. And I didn't stop until I defeated them. And I destroyed them and struck them down. And he gave me strength for battle and brought my enemies down. He was my salvation. He answered me, but not my enemies. I pounded them and destroyed them with God's support. You have rescued me, God, from all these peoples who wanted my ruin, and kept me from the nations, the enemies. Now the B'nai Nechar, he spends 3 or 4 verses on the B'nai Nechar, which means the non-Jewish enemies. They tried to attack me. They tried to deny me. They turned their ear against me. They, however, lost their courage because I stood stalwartly with God. Chai Adonai Ubarach Tzuri, V'yarum Elohei Tzur Yishi. The Lord lives, and blessed is the Lord, my rock. Praises he who gave me that support. God who takes vengeance when needs to be, and just delivers me from my enemies. Therefore, Al Kain Odcha Adonai Bagoyim Ulishimcha Zamer. I will thank God among the nations and sing his name, sing your name. And he finally concludes with Migdol Yeshuot Malko, Yoseh Chesed Limshicho, with David Ulzaro Adolam, which is what we say in Birkat, by the way. Tower of victory to the king, who deals with kindness to his anointed, the Mashiach, David, the anointed one, to David and his offspring forever, for eternity. So this is a pretty powerful last song that David shares. And he then has 2 more chapters, which we'll discuss next week. This chapter is really one of, as I said, a lot of repetition, a lot of thankfulness, a lot of praising God, a lot of extolling, and also, looking back on his life and what he was able to accomplish only through God. So it's a little bit of introspection, a little bit of congratulating his achievements through standing with God and what God did for him. And in that, he seems to be, we'd like to think that chapter 23 is his final chapter. He's going to talk about his final words. And then, unfortunately, chapter 24 ends on a certain sour note. We'll talk about that next week. Until then, have a good day, and shalom from the Judean hills, and have a good